The slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. An elderly black woman stood frozen, her cheek burning, her dignity tested in front of strangers who didn't know whether to step in or look away. The man who struck her straightened his suit, convinced he'd just humiliated someone powerless. Phones were already recording. Silence filled the room. What he didn't know, what no one there knew, was that this single moment would unravel everything he believed about power, protection, and consequence. Because the woman he struck wasn't alone in this world, and the truth about her son was about to change his life forever. Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And subscribe for more powerful stories. Before that moment in the diner, Dorothy Washington's life followed a quiet, dignified rhythm shaped by decades of purpose. Every morning began the same way in her modest apartment, sunlight filtering through carefully hung curtains, illuminating a space filled with memories rather than luxury. Framed photographs lined the walls, years of teaching, community events, graduations, and family milestones. They told the story of a woman who had spent her life lifting others, often without recognition, and never expecting anything in return. Dorothy was known throughout the neighborhood as someone you could trust. She volunteered, mentored, organized, and listened. When families struggled, she found help. When doors closed, she somehow knew which ones could be opened. People didn't ask how. They simply knew that when Dorothy Washington showed up, things had a way of getting better. Her reputation wasn't built on power or wealth, but on consistency, kindness, and an unshakable sense of self-worth. Once a week without fail, Dorothy met her close friend Helen Morrison for lunch at the same neighborhood diner. It was a tradition rooted in comfort, not habit. The diner wasn't fancy, but it was familiar. The staff greeted her by name. Other customers smiled when they saw her. It was one of the few places where time seemed to slow down, where Dorothy could simply exist without carrying the weight of everyone else's problems. What most people didn't know, or only vaguely understood, was the life her son, Vincent Washington, lived beyond that neighborhood. Dorothy spoke of him with pride, but never details. She raised him to value discipline, loyalty, and respect, principles that guided every choice he made. Whatever world Vincent operated in, it was one that demanded control, precision, and consequences. On the day everything changed, Dorothy walked into the diner expecting nothing more than lunch and conversation. She had no reason to believe this ordinary afternoon would collide with someone else's unchecked arrogance. But across the room, another life, driven by entitlement and rage, was already spiraling toward her. And neither of them yet understood that their paths were about to intersect in a way that would expose the true cost of disrespect. The tension inside the diner didn't erupt all at once. It crept in quietly, carried on irritation, entitlement, and a sense of superiority that had been building long before Richard Sterling walked through the door. He arrived already angry, already convinced the world was beneath him. The cramped space, the worn booths, the familiar warmth of the diner felt like an insult to someone who believed respect was owed to him on sight. As Dorothy Washington settled into her usual booth with Helen Morrison, the room followed its normal rhythm. Plates clinked, coffee poured, soft conversations drifted between tables. Dorothy's movements were careful and unassuming, shaped by age and habit rather than fear. When her elbow brushed the edge of Sterling's table, the moment was small, barely noticeable to anyone else. But for Sterling, it was everything. The spill of coffee across his briefcase felt like a personal attack, an offense committed by someone he had already decided didn't belong near him. What followed unfolded rapidly. Sterling's frustration turned sharp, his voice rising, his presence expanding as he drew attention to himself. The diner grew quiet, not from curiosity but discomfort. Dorothy responded with calm restraint, trying to correct a simple mistake, trying to de-escalate a situation that didn't need to exist. But calm only seemed to fuel Sterling further. To him, composure looked like defiance. As his anger spilled out, it carried more than blame. It carried years of unchecked bias, contempt, and belief in hierarchy. Each step he took toward Dorothy tightened the air in the room. Helen Morrison sensed the shift immediately, her concern visible as she watched a harmless accident transform into something darker. Maria Santos, behind the counter, recognized the warning signs of trouble and moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary. Sterling's words grew more venomous, his posture more aggressive. He saw Dorothy not as an elderly woman, not as a respected member of the community, but as an inconvenience he was entitled to correct. Phones began to rise around the diner, instinctively capturing the moment. Not because people wanted spectacle, but because something felt wrong, and everyone understood the weight of what was unfolding. Dorothy stood not in confrontation but in dignity. Her presence shifted the energy in the room. She did not shrink or retreat. She did not raise her voice. That quiet strength unsettled Sterling more than any argument could have. To him, resistance from someone he considered powerless was unacceptable. The situation crossed a line when control slipped from words into physical dominance. The moment Sterling grabbed Dorothy's wrist, the room collectively held its breath. Fear spread quickly, not just fear for Dorothy, but fear of what Sterling might do next. Maria Santos moved decisively. Helen Morrison stepped forward, but before anyone could stop him, the situation exploded into violence. The slap cut through the diner with shocking clarity. Time seemed to pause as Dorothy staggered, her wedding ring slipping from her finger and rolling across the floor. The sound alone told everyone present that this was no longer an argument. It was an assault. Chaos followed, shock, outrage, panic. Phones captured every second as Maria called for help and customers rushed to Dorothy's side, yet Dorothy did not collapse into hysteria. She remained upright steady, her expression revealing something far more powerful than anger. It was awareness, an understanding that this moment would not end here. Sterling, meanwhile, adjusted his suit and breathed heavily, convinced he had asserted control, convinced there would be no real consequences. What he didn't see was the man in the corner observing everything. What he didn't understand was that this act had triggered forces far beyond the diner's walls. As police sirens approached, Sterling still believed the system would protect him. He had no idea that Dorothy Washington was not alone, and that her son, Vincent Washington, would soon learn exactly what had happened. And when that knowledge reached Vincent, the true consequences of that slap would begin to take shape. The moment the police arrived, the diner no longer felt like a neighborhood refuge. It became a scene of reckoning. Officers moved through the crowd, separating voices, collecting statements, surveying faces still frozen in shock. Dorothy Washington sat quietly, her cheek visibly swollen, her posture unchanged. She did not demand attention. She did not cry out for sympathy. That silence carried more weight than any accusation. Richard Sterling wasted no time reclaiming what he believed was his natural advantage. He presented himself as composed, controlled, and credible. His confidence wasn't subtle, it was practiced. Years of navigating power structures had taught him how to dominate a room without raising his voice. He assumed the situation would bend in his favor, just as it always had. To him, this was a misunderstanding that would be smoothed over, another inconvenience erased by status and connections. But something had shifted. The phone still recording told a different story. Witnesses stood firm. The truth had already escaped the diner and was spreading beyond its walls. Within hours, the footage began circulating, raw, undeniable, impossible to reframe. The slap, the slurs, the moment control turned into cruelty. What Sterling believed would be forgotten was instead preserved, shared, and questioned by thousands. Dorothy was asked for an emergency contact. She gave one name, Vincent Washington. When the call reached him, everything changed. Vincent did not react with visible rage. He did not rush. He listened. Every detail settled into place with precision. His world was one of calculated responses, not impulsive reactions, but this was different. This was personal. Someone had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Someone had touched the one person he protected without question. From that moment on, the system began to move, quietly at first. The case did not disappear. It escalated. Evidence was reviewed with unusual speed. Prior complaints surfaced. Patterns emerged. Sterling's history, once buried beneath settlements and influence, was suddenly visible. The same tools he had used to silence others now exposed him. As the investigation deepened, Sterling's confidence began to crack. Clients distanced themselves. Partners questioned him. Institutions that once welcomed him hesitated. The protection he believed was permanent revealed itself as conditional. Every call unanswered, every meeting canceled chipped away at the identity he had built around untouchability. Dorothy, meanwhile, remained steady. She refused interviews. She refused spectacle. Her strength was not loud, but it was undeniable. Community members rallied, not in chaos, but in clarity. This was no longer just about an assault. It was about accountability, about how easily dignity could be violated and how rarely it was defended. Then came the moment Sterling could no longer avoid. Formal charges were filed. The case moved forward not quietly, not conveniently, but publicly. For the first time, he stood on the opposite side of the system he once controlled. The same rules he had bent were now rigid. The same scrutiny he had dismissed was now unavoidable. As Sterling prepared to face the consequences, he finally understood the truth he had ignored from the beginning. Dorothy Washington was never powerless, and Vincent Washington was not simply a concerned son. He was a man who understood how power really worked, and the reckoning was just beginning. When the case finally reached its conclusion, the outcome was undeniable. Richard Sterling was no longer shielded by reputation, wealth, or influence. The evidence spoke clearly, and for once it was impossible to ignore. The slap in the diner was no longer dismissed as a moment of anger. It was recognized for what it truly was, an act of racial violence rooted in entitlement and dehumanization. Sterling faced real consequences, not just legally, but socially and professionally. The world he once navigated with ease closed its doors to him one by one. Dorothy Washington returned to her life quietly. There were no victory speeches, no celebration of another man's downfall. She went back to her routine, back to the diner, back to the community she had always served. But something had changed. People saw her not just as a kind woman, but as a symbol of dignity under fire. Her calm strength became a reminder that resistance does not always look like anger. Sometimes it looks like refusing to be broken. The impact of what happened rippled far beyond that single afternoon. Conversations began where silence once lived. People who had looked away before were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about power, race, and accountability. The footage, the testimony, and the outcome became part of a larger reckoning, one that exposed how easily injustice can occur and how rare it is for it to be corrected. Vincent Washington remained in the background, just as he preferred. He did not seek recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that the system, when pressed to do the right thing, had finally worked the way it was supposed to. Not through intimidation, not through chaos, but through consequences. This was never just about a slap in a diner. It was about how quickly humanity can be stripped away and how powerful it is when someone refuses to let that happen. Dorothy Washington did not fight back with violence. She stood her ground with dignity and in doing so forced the world to pay attention. The question is not whether this story is rare. The question is, how many stories like this never reach the light? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.